Okay, so part two of today's lecture is on going to go into a little bit more detail about youth transitions, youth cultures, and bridging the gap. Again, it's going to be fairly light on detail today because we'll go into it in some depth throughout the course. There'll be a couple of weeks on these things. So to begin with, youth transitions is kind of, I suppose, the key sociological area of research when it comes to youth studies and youth sociology in particular, obviously. There's been three specific kinds of areas to look at in terms of transitions. There's the careers, relationships, and independence. And again, the transition metaphor here is that you're meant to go from being a kind of, irresponsible child to a more responsible adult, having no independence to having full independence and all that kind of thing. So this has a fairly kind of linear understanding of our life trajectories. That doesn't really make a lot of sense today. So, maybe you could have stereotypically said, maybe in the mid 20th century that, people were born and then you go to school and you get a job, then you get married, you have a family, you have kids, you retire and then you die, in that order. Today, it doesn't really happen as simply as that. And youth studies as a kind of subdiscipline of sociology has been really important to kind of think about the life course in that sense. And the research done since the 90s, in a time of really rapid social changes, uncovered the kind of non-linearity of these kind of transitions. So, is the transition getting longer or shorter? I suppose in some ways it depends on which way you kind of think about it. But for the most part, we think about transitions as getting longer, to the point where in the field now it's starting to be questioned whether transition is a useful metaphor to think about the idea of youth at all. So we can see that the transitions themselves are becoming increasingly kind of prolonged. There's kind of a zigzag, one step forward, two step back kind of thing in many respects. And so, particularly people are entering full-time work much later in life, sometimes, if at all, as the labour market itself becomes increasingly precarious and insecure and casualised. Young people are living at home for longer and longer. Again, there's all kinds of real economic reasons for this, particularly as education becomes more important and the labour market's been upwardly credentialised. It means young people have to study for longer to get the jobs that previous generations could have got straight after school. And in connection to that, people are getting married and having kids later, and we'll talk about moral panics and around this kind of stuff later on in the course. But there's very sensible economic reasons why that's happening. So in many respects, people are kind of, growing up, in inverted commas, later. But others say that they're growing up earlier and earlier. And again, there's a lot of moral panics around this stuff about kind of, sex, drugs and rock and roll stuff happening earlier in life, the internet and the exposure to risks, and increasingly the way that, even kids at primary school now have to kind of deal with things like terrorism and global warming and stuff like that, and the knowledge of those kind of catastrophes. So there's kind of juxtaposition here between, longer or shorter transitions, but from the transition kind of, social economic point of view, we kind of think about those things as getting longer. Now, that's not to say that the idea of transition still isn't important, but many of those markers of adulthood, of, getting a full-time job, buying your own house, getting married, that kind of tend to happen by the time people will say 25, increasingly look like, almost upwardly mobile markers of youth. I mean, to be able to afford to do those things at that age is increasingly rare. So youth studies has been really useful for thinking about this kind of life course changes, and certainly there's a whole bunch of really interesting and strong research that shows that there's inequalities in terms of how people of different classes, races and genders and sexualities and things like that can approach that transition. And we'll look at some of that later on in the course. So we can think about these things as being mostly longer, and it also means that young people's expectations change from one generation to the next. And so in some ways that's a kind of useful way to think about generations that we'll talk about later in the course. So it's an increasing expectation that they'll change careers, that their working lives just won't be kind of, getting a job in one company and working your way up to the top. People moving around much more between companies, and even moving around between completely different careers, and going back to TAFE or university or whatever, and completely changing what they're going to do next. So there's a few kind of metaphorical ways to think about this, that the transition has become extended, it's become blurry, it's become a zigzag. Young people are having fewer children, having them later in life. So in many ways this kind of markers of, that full adult citizenship thing that happened maybe in the early 20s, a couple of generations ago, sometimes now doesn't happen at all into the kind of, mid-40s, if it does happen at all. So all three kinds of extensions are extending in the period we call late modernity, sometimes called late capitalism. We'll talk about the notion of risk society and reflexive modernity later on in the course as well. So the biographies of young people in this sense are blending these transitions experiences. So it doesn't happen in a straight line, but you might be both studying and working, you might be living at home at the same time, and then you might move out with a partner and that might break up and then you move back home. Again, this is kind of that blurry zigzag nature of what's going on increasingly is the norm today. One of the ways of thinking about this is through the notion of individualization, where there's a kind of social pressure, I suppose, what Bourdieu calls a doxa, that it's up to us as individuals to kind of tailor-make our own lives, to make the correct choices, and to navigate all the risks that are kind of inherent in these transition processes. And by risks here, I mean things like, making the wrong choice for the university course, or, not applying for the job, or not taking a job that you're offered even though you have to move thousands of kilometres to do it. The idea here is that we're increasingly under individual pressure to kind of, I suppose, solve the problems that are actually largely out of our control. Many of these kind of problems about, the casualisation of the workplace, the precarious nature of labour markets and all this kind of stuff are actually the product of economic decisions and economic systems that individuals don't have a lot of control over, but the way that we think about solving those problems today come back to the individual all the time. And we'll look at this in some detail in future weeks as well. So we need to kind of think, I suppose, how useful this transition metaphor is anymore if people aren't really becoming adults till much later in life in terms of those markers. And maybe this means that we have to actually completely reinvent the very notion of what adulthood means. So we'll look quite in some detail in future weeks at the work of Ulrich Beck, so I won't go into it in too much detail now. But the concept of risk will be quite important in the course. It's in the title of the course, so it obviously is going to be. But we'll think about the notions of choice in particular around this idea of risk and the way that we have to constantly, weigh up the positives and negatives of everything to kind of, I suppose, move forward in our trajectory of life. So this means there's a responsibility to make the right choices, but we'll look at kinds of the different kinds of inequalities that actually make the very idea of choice, and particularly the ideas of meritocracies and stuff like that, quite dubious in many ways. So there's a kind of play-off here with these pressures of this making individual choices, while those kind of contours of inequality such as class and gender, race, ethnicity, religion, all these different things still have a huge impetus on what we can and can't do. So a key idea here is the idea of detraditionalization, the kind of withering away of old forms of social collectives. The disappearance of kind of trade unionism out of workplaces, the way that kind of people don't vote, with their class or their economic interests as much anymore. This means that we kind of move towards this idea of our self as a reflexive project to be worked upon. But we need to be really careful here with kind of thinking about that as an idea of freedom, and again we'll go into some detail in future weeks about why kind of associating choice with freedom is really problematic from a sociological perspective. So you'll see that I'm particularly interested in class. My research is mostly interested in kind of class inequalities, and I'm interested not just in the kind of material notions of class, but also the cultural aspects as well. And so there's specific weeks over the course that kind of looks at that in some detail. But we'll look in when we look at the work of Ulrich Beck, we'll also in that week look at the work of Pierre Bourdieu to think about how class is still really important in thinking about opportunities in particular. And maybe while things like class consciousness and class politics may have dwindled somewhat, at least in terms of the way that people understand their lives themselves, economic and social inequalities are still have, huge ramifications, probably more ramifications than ever before in many respects. So I won't go into the Bourdieu stuff too much detail now. I think if you're doing a third year sociology course, you're probably relatively familiar with some of these concepts already. But we'll be kind of thinking with and through Bourdieu to kind of look at a number of different case studies around punk, around effective labour, and around bar work, and all this kind of other research that I've been involved in over the last few years. So we'll do a whole week where I kind of unpack some of Bourdieu's concepts in some detail. So the second traditional area of youth studies research has been on youth culture. So you can see in some respects there's been a kind of separation between the kind of, important everyday decisions that people have to make to, become, to get the career they want and, get a house and all this kind of stuff. And there was a separate area of research going on about what people do in their leisure time and the way that they're creative and the way that they associate with other people that are like them and, the way they have enjoyment and stuff like that. So youth cultures has been a really important way to think about that, and it's often been studied through the lens of consumption. But importantly, youth cultures are an area where young people are really creative, and they kind of, produce their own things, they rework things from the past. So we can think about youth cultures as a kind of area of practice and activity where there's both creativity and conformity, where people will, challenge ideologies but also kind of follow them. There's differences here between kind of mainstream, in inverted commas, practices and, resistive subcultures. Youth cultures in particular have been a way of thinking about how young people don't just kind of, reproduce what previous generations do. They often challenge those hegemonies and challenge those norms and try and, make the world in their own image somewhat. So consumption has been a particularly good way of thinking about this, the different musics that people are into and the different TV shows they watch. And increasingly we can think about that as prosumption when we look at the internet, how Facebook and stuff like that are not just areas where we consume things, but we also like things and talk to each other, and we actually produce a whole bunch of data that creates value for those practices, for those platforms. But I like to emphasise the kind of creative and artistic practices that young people are involved in those kind of cultural practices. And we'll talk about that later on between, different ways of thinking about that from the Frankfurt School and the Birmingham School, and even through new theories of labour. So we can think about this with, the example of punk, and we'll do a week or two on this in the course as well. And you can think about, the way that a kind of subcultural genre like punk that's, now been more generalised into a kind of attitude that cuts across different practices, can be a way of thinking about the kind of playoff between conformity and creativity. So you can see, the images change over time, particularly in the way that it's represented in popular culture. On one hand, back in the 70s, you had Sid Vicious, injecting himself with heroin and spitting on the audience. Today we have like the Madden Brothers on, international kind of reality television shows. So some people would want to track that as a kind of process of co-optation, the way the punk, starts as kind of resistive exercise and becomes very much co-opted back into the mainstream to sell us stuff. So it's originally been positioned as a resistive subculture, but, as those kind of things developed in London and New York, then scenes kind of pop up all over the world. And there's a myriad of different things going on there, the ways that people kind of do punk and also reinvent it themselves in those places. So there's a kind of real local, global way of developing those practices that happens that are really interesting to look at in terms of the way that globalization works and the ways that local identities kind of, are built around kind of, engaging with this kind of more global images and aesthetics and practices. So we can see punk also that, like within the field of punk, or the scenes of punk, there's actually struggles going on within them about what punk should be. And we'll look at that in some detail in future weeks in terms of identity and gender and sexuality and notions of authenticity and stuff like that. So again, you can see here just on this one example that there's kind of lots of little ways of thinking about, everyday activities that can help us kind of connect the individual to broader societal trends and structures. Importantly, youth cultures are increasingly online, and there's a whole bunch of incredible research in youth studies that looks at this kind of stuff. Later in the course, one of the weeks I'll be talking to Akane Kanai about her work about friendship and blog activities like that are on Tumblr and other platforms like that. And so, something like punk, for instance, is again a good example that it starts in these kind of, bars and basements in various cities. It spreads out through the world, but now it spreads out through various mediums, and there's a whole bunch of, spaces online where punk practice happens. And this is the same with, all kinds of different subcultures and youth cultural practices. So definitely the way that youth cultures have developed, reflect many of the processes of globalization. And again, those things will come up throughout the course as well. So in recent years, as I said, there's been a kind of attempt to bridge the gap between transitions and cultures. Now, in some ways, the kind of picture of them being completely separate over the decades as youth studies developed has kind of been exaggerated a little bit. There was always kind of work going on that, bridged that divide. But more recently, there's been a kind of real effort to make sure that there's a combination between the two. This idea that kind of transition studies need to be more culturally rich, while youth cultural studies need to be more aware of kind of the spatial divisions and the kind of class analysis and gender analysis that's needed to think about the way that young people do youth culture differently. So, in particular, there's been kind of really interesting way of thinking about this as kind of, youth cultures are a kind of rite of passage that are just as important in terms of being transitioning from being a child to an adult as that kind of transitions research. So where that kind of transitions research focused on, things like getting your own house and getting your own job, the rites of passage kind of understanding of youth cultures as a way of thinking about how young people go out into the world, they're away from their parents, they tend to be doing, things that maybe their parents don't like too much, like drinking and, having sex and all this kind of stuff, meeting people that are outside that kind of initial family group, and finding a way to be in the world that kind of reflects who they want to be rather than maybe what their parents want them to be. And so, again, this is a way of thinking about that transition and the way that youth cultures and leisure practices are really important for that. Another way of thinking about those youth leisure practices is that they can be, in some ways, a way of escaping the pressures of everyday life of trying to get a job and doing well at uni and stuff like that. So here, youth subcultures and youth leisure practices and night clubbing and club cultures and stuff like that are seen as a kind of place of, being able to relax and, be yourself and not have to perform this kind of neoliberal decision-making machine, I suppose. So again, we can see here the ways that these kind of spaces, need to be thought of as not being completely separate. And the better kind of forms of, I think, youth studies today increasingly, do that as normal practice.